Today we're going to talk about boundaries with guilt and shame. We have been using a book called Boundaries for Your Soul, and we've been kind of going through one chapter at a time. And the chapter that we're on today is about guilt and shame. It's something I think we all can relate to in one way or another. And so what I want to tell you a story about myself in a little bit. Before we get there, I have a quote that I want to share with you from Brene Brown. And she said, to embrace and love who we are, we have to reclaim and reconnect with the parts of ourselves that have been orphaned over the years. So there are parts of us that we've kind of left behind for one reason or another. We call these vulnerable parts. Some people have called them exiled parts. In the Bible, in the very middle of the Bible, is a book called Psalms, and Psalm number 25 in verse 3 says, "No one who hopes in you, God, will ever be put to shame." And so there's this idea that when we put our hope in God, that sense of shame that we carry in life can sort of dissipate in the presence of God. And I think all of us would want that, because who wants to have that sense of guilt and shame that we know so well? What is guilt and what is shame? Well, guilt is a painful emotion that's experienced when one believes one's actions or thoughts have violated a moral or a personal standard. So sometimes it's a moral standard that we have in mind, and sometimes it's our own standard. And so we feel guilty because we're not meeting it. Shame is what we would say is like a painful emotion that's caused by a belief that one is or is perceived by others to be inferior or unworthy, or we're not worthy of affection, we're not worthy of respect, maybe because of our actions or our thoughts, or maybe the circumstances or the experiences. Think about Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden, one of the very first, this first story. In the Garden of Eden, Adam and Eve had no shame. We could say that was a pre-shame moment. Shame would not occur to them because they had never sinned. They hadn't done anything wrong. And in fact, the Bible has very explicit words for it. It says they were naked and they were unashamed. They were unashamed because they didn't know they were naked. They didn't know to have shame or any sense of guilt. And so it's really interesting to think about a time when there was no shame, a time when there was no guilt. But the burden of shame, then, it comes from somewhere. Where does it come from? Well, first of all, we could say it comes from evil, or it comes from the evil one. That's where some of our shame comes from. The Bible says that the devil's an accuser, that he's constantly accusing us of wrong. Sometimes it comes from others. Other people will accuse us. We kind of get this idea of a judge, and people maybe judging us and kind of holding up cards. We did 5 out of 10 on that, or 3 out of 10, or something like that. We're not measuring up to other people's standards. And then of course we have our own inner critics that are often even tougher than other people. And so these are some of the places where shame comes from. One of the things I think of when I think of shame for myself is going through my grandparents' closet as a I don't know, say like a preteen or a teenager, and I guess I used to play in their closet. And one time I saw there was a jacket in there, and I was going through, and I found inside of one of the pockets of this jacket an envelope that had a stack of $100 bills bigger than I'd ever seen in my life before. And I took some of those $100 bills, and I didn't tell anybody, and I spent a lot of it on things that I wanted. And I think I even might have given money to my church based on how much I had taken, because I knew that was important. But later, of course, I felt this sense of guilt and shame that I had done this. And if I disregarded that feeling, I would have had to live with that for the rest of my life, and it probably would have gone underground and manifest in some other way in my life. But if I allowed that feeling to take over, I would then see myself as worthless, and I'd probably keep doing what I'm doing because there's no hope for me to change. The inner critic would have completely taken over me, and I would have continued doing that because there was no hope for me. What actually happened was that I was able to focus on that part of me and befriend that part of me that wanted to do wrong. And I realized that it was underneath was this young man who seemingly lost everything. When I was about to turn 11, I lost my mother and my stepfather, and so there's a part of me that felt then very vulnerable, and I'll do almost anything to make that sense of vulnerability go away. And so that means that in this case there was what we could say is like a firefighter, and the firefighter is trying to put out that pain of feeling vulnerable. And my firefighter manifests himself by taking something that didn't belong to him to try to fill that gap, to try to meet this need of living in a world where I can't get what I need. Normally, I need to go and reach out for it and get it because of what happened when I was younger. And so what I did was I invited that part of myself that felt the need to take that money. I invited it and I unburdened it by bringing it to God. As I brought that vulnerable part of myself to Jesus, he showed me that, yes, I had lost so much in life, but that he was filling in those things that I lacked. He was filling up my life, even though I had lost and there was a big hole in my life. And indeed, over the years, I've lost a lot of money in different ways. And God showed me over time that while people may be taking, money out of my front pockets, he's putting money in my back pockets. He always has my back, and he's always taking care of me. And that's a great image that I have that God showed me. Talking about the firefighter part, the firefighters, we talk about firefighter parts, they are designed to extinguish pain. And so I had this firefighter part of me, and when he saw that the vulnerable part of me wasn't so vulnerable because God is taking care of me, now that part of me can sit back realizing that the vulnerable part of me has the protection that it needs. I was also able to confess this and to make it right with my grandmother. That was hard, to sit down with her and tell her that I took money out of her closet. But in the place of shame and guilt now, I found God's love and the love of my grandmother, and even a hug at the end of our conversation. She understood that would be a temptation for any kid my age, and she forgave me. So I want to talk today briefly about the benefits of guilt and shame, because there are some benefits. Guilt and shame can lead you to parts of yourself that need your attention. In this case, there was a part of me that needed attention, and the shame and guilt that was in my life pointed me back to deal with these parts of me that needed to be dealt with. Also, this can be an invitation to step out in courage. I needed to step out in courage and make things right with my grandmother. And also, guilt and shame can alert us to the fact that there's emotional danger, and there certainly was emotional danger in this situation where I had done something that was a breach of relationship. Guilt and shame can also motivate us to discover our true identity. So I'm not a little kid anymore who needs to steal money in order to get ahead. My true identity is that I'm a child of God. And so guilt and shame pointed me and motivated me to really discover who I really am. Are there some dangers with guilt and shame? Sure, I think we all know that. Unaddressed shame can give us the feeling that we aren't good enough, that there's something inherently wrong with me. Now, we all know that we're sinners and there's something inherently wrong with us in that way, but somehow we think we're more sinful than the next person, or we're worse than the next person because of the way that we sin. Another thing is that this can really interrupt our creative process and can cause us to hesitate to take risks when we feel this kind of guilt and shame. Also, we may feel defensive. We may have a fear of being rejected. We may also have a tendency to withdraw from others because of guilt and shame. Some of us might lie or blame others or manipulate, or we might even just people please all the time because of our guilt and shame. For some of us, there would be this tremendous internal chaos. And for some of us, that might manifest itself like it did in my life with suicidal thoughts. And so these are all the dangers of guilt and shame and why we need to address it head on. Now, so what are some of the needs? What does guilt and shame need? Well, our guilt and shame need to learn to be vulnerable and experience the compassion of our spirit-led self. So in that moment, I needed to be vulnerable, and I needed to realize that there was this part of me that was really vulnerable, and I needed to be compassionate to that so I could bring myself to my grandmother, who, thank God, was also compassionate with me. What other needs are there? Well, we need to learn a new perspective. that you don't have to beat yourself up. And I didn't have to beat myself up about this. I needed to go and then make things right. Also, we need to let Jesus mend the injury that caused our shame. And in this case, God did that for me. And also, we need to practice hearing God's voice of truth and love. So at some point, God began to speak to me and say, what you did was wrong. And guilt and shame pointed me back to him so that I could hear that it was his voice telling me what's true, but also telling me that he loves me, even though I did this thing that was wrong. What fears might our guilt and shame have? Certainly there's fear involved. I may be proved a fool. If I go to my grandmother and I say something, she might not treat me well. I'll be exposed as a fraud. Like I'm supposed to be this kid that's doing the right thing and I wasn't doing the right thing, and now people are going to find out about it. Or I'll be cut off or shut off or rejected and I'll end up alone. These are some of the fears that we may have. There are 3 parts that I could point to today that are in the book that would kind of help us, give us a character for these parts of us that feel shame and guilt. One of them is the shaming inner critic. This part of us reminds us of all the ways that we don't measure up. One picture I have is of like a very religious person, and she's standing there with a ruler, like she's going to slap somebody with it, and she's got an entire list of all the things that you're supposed to do, and that if you don't do, you're not measuring up. That would be the shaming inner critic. A picture of that. Another part that we could tease out of here is a guilty conscience. And the guilty conscience is actually a good thing. This part of us can become an important advisor on the road that leads to life. We know that Jesus leads us to the road to life. And so our conscience, when it feels guilty, can bring us back to God, can bring us back into, in the case that I mentioned, a good relationship with another person, or to mend things. And then there's one more part, which we could call the perfectionistic part. And for the perfectionistic part, this part of us is on a quest for love and significance and security. And perfectionistic parts work tirelessly to prove our worth. We work hard in our family, we work hard at our job or whatever, because we're trying to let people know, hey, we're worth something. We need to understand that it is trying to keep us from those feelings of shame. Those perfectionistic parts are trying to keep us from those feelings of shame. And one idea that I'll give you as we're sort of wrapping this up to a close is that one person has said that it can be very helpful to take a shame inventory, and that is to write down how many times a day you're feeling shame. The idea is paying attention to what you're paying attention to. A lot of times I'm paying attention to something, my mind's going with worry or the inner critic, but I'm not paying attention to the fact that I'm paying attention to this. I'm just doing it without thinking about it, without evaluating it. And so the idea of writing these things down can be helpful so you can see it on paper. And the thing is, we need to change the narrative. Instead of this need that I might have to scratch and claw my way to meeting my own needs, or this need that I have to be perfect so people will love me, I can say what is true about me. I can change the narrative, and the narrative would sound a lot better if I said, I'm a child of God. God will take care of me, and he will meet all of my needs according to his riches and glory in Christ Jesus. That's a very different story than a young man who's lost everything and has lost his way and needs to scratch his way back. So this has been a discussion on Boundaries for Your Soul. It's a book by Allison Cook and Kimberly Miller. Next time we get together, we're going to talk about what do we do about setting boundaries with the challenging parts of others, because other people have parts just like we are. Other people have emotions just like we do. And a lot of times we'll run into those emotions or run into a problem with somebody. How can we use the language of parts to help us deal with other people's parts and other people's issues that they bring into relationship with us? That's where we're going to go next time. If you want to join us for that discussion, you can go to meetups.com /check your compass. So that's meetup.com /check your compass. You can also check out our videos on YouTube and Facebook. We typically post one video a week, and we're posting them right now on this called Internal Family Systems, is what we've been talking about today. Thanks for listening.